Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast. I'm Jason Staples, together with Erik Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers, the books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about them. So without further ado, let's get to the episode.
Today we're going to cover the book Who, a story about the founding of the band Who. The Who. Just kidding, this is a book about hiring. It's by Geoff Smart and Randy Street. And if you put their names together, it's Smart Street or Street Smart, which is a good description of the book. A lot of practical ideas, a book focused on simple and objective process for hiring. Noah Kagan recommended the book in Tools of Titans. He's the 30th employee at Facebook, or he was the 4th at Mint. He's the founder of SumoMe.
That's Mint.com, not the U.S. Mint, which would have made him a very old man, but...
And probably wealthy.
Yeah, well. He's probably wealthy either way.
Yeah. Yeah. If he got some of those stock options at as the 30th employee of Facebook, he's doing all right.
I think he's doing fine.
At $160 a pop. Free tools. So he's founder of SumoMe, which offers free tools to grow website traffic. The authors of this book, Geoff Smart and Randy Street, they both work for G.H. Smart, an advisory firm that exists to help leaders amplify their positive impact on the world. Geoff is the chairman and founder of that company. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Leadocracy and co-author of a book called Power Score. Randy Street is is a managing partner at G.H. Smart and co-author of Power Score. And he's a leadership advisor to boards and CEOs and an internationally acclaimed public speaker. So those are the authors of the book. So should we start off with the overview again?
Like internationally acclaimed.
Just two nations. I mean, if one person in Canada likes you, you're set.
I need to work on getting a contact somewhere, internationally that can acclaim me.
Yeah, you just need one.
Yeah,
and you're set.
I think that's got to be. I think I'll put that on my 2018 goals. I mean, I got my goals for 2017, and it looks like I'm going to miss on about half of them, so some of them will roll over. But I got some others in there, but I think it's a little much to try to find an acclaimer in another country. But I want to be internationally acclaimed.
I would just go to Fiverr.com and see if
someone will acclaim me.
If you can pay somebody $5 to acclaim you from Canada.
There we go. Okay, I think that might work. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the overview before we get into our favorite quotes. Yeah.
All right. So my quick and easy overview here is that this was a simple, straightforward approach to hiring. Myself, I've never had to hire anyone, so it was a good book in understanding what goes into hiring and more of a...
What should go into hiring.
Yeah, what should go into hiring. And more, I view this as one of those books that's going to be a good reference book to look through at that time. So I kind of read it in that vein of, this is great information, not immediately applicable to me, but great advice. And also kind of helped me just think through if I was to apply for a job, how would I prepare and that sort of thing. So it was good on those two fronts, both if I do hire someone in the future and if I'm the interviewee on in some other phase of life. And in terms of the time frame, so for the Books of Titans project, I chose 52 books, and then I went to randomizer.org, and you can put in a list. I must do this every day for my to-do list just to mix things up. I'll put in my to-do list in there and randomize it, and then it's like someone else has chosen what order I work on things. And for some reason, I can just fly through stuff like that. But if I write down the order and how I should do it, I can't do it. But anyway, I did that for the 52 books that we're reading this year for Books of Titans. And so it's a completely random list of the order. And it's interesting that this book fell in between two other books, the first being Effective Executive, which we covered last week, and then after this book is Start With Why. So the Effective Executive really focused a lot on the personal you, like who but in a personal sense of being an effective manager of yourself, manager of your time, and stuff like that. This book covers the who, and they say if you get the who right, then you'll get the what right. The who people will get the what right in your company. And next week's book, Start With Why, covers the why. And the premise of that book is if you start with why, then the what and the how follow. So it's just an interesting 3-set book here in how they fit together.
3-book
so
set.
We'll talk about. So what's that?
Or a 3-book set, you mean?
Oh yeah,
your Lextesia kicked in there. You said 3-set book, but but yeah,
2-step.
This does go really well with the other two. I mean, it's interesting the way that they each are emphasizing something different, but they all go together. Now, the interesting thing to me about Start With, or about who, or what I might refer to as the owl book. The interesting thing here is that they say start with who, but at the same time, when they're talking about how you decide who to hire and who to bring in, what do you actually have to start with?
Defining what you want.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that's interesting about this book to me is everything is about who, and you have to really emphasize that you get the right people in your company, but you know that they're the right people when they fit. And we'll talk about this when we get further into the more detailed zone here in a little bit. But when they fit the scorecard of what you have, of the what that you have envisioned for that specific role. And one of the problems that they flag about why people hire poorly is oftentimes they don't adequately define what they want from whom they are hiring. So I found that interesting that it's a book about who, but in order to get the who right, you have to get the what right to hire a good who. But then here's where it gets kind of a little bit inceptionist or inception-esque is the real thing that needs to be done in order to get that who done properly, in order to bring in or in order to get the what done properly, in order to bring in the proper who. So this is getting all confusing and the use of these various interrogatives, but the thing that needs to happen first is the executive or the manager or whoever is making the hire has to actually have the who taken care of with themselves, right? So in order to be able to make the good scorecard, in order to be able to set the direction that you want that affects who you're going to hire and make sure that you get the right who, you actually have to become, or you have to first be, an effective executive. And so that actually is where reading this right after Drucker's book actually works really well, because it is about who still, but sometimes the who is you. And that's one of the things that stood out to me, sort of looking at these two books, or at these two books, that one and this one, and in this order is, who is everything in the company, but the first who sets the direction has to set the what for everybody else, and then that is going to determine everything else. So that's where the company has to be solid at the very top in terms of leadership level and in terms of the people who are going to be handling that. Yeah,
and I mean I see a market opportunity here to write a book about the when and the where, because no one's covering that at all.
Yeah, that actually we should go ahead and do that for our fourth and fifth books of the series, and then maybe try to get them packaged. You can buy these as a package deal on Amazon or something. Who knows? But
we'd have to define where that they could purchase it.
Yeah, well, I mean that would certainly, you'd want to be in Amazon and Walmart, of course. Got to make sure you're there. That's true success. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, one of the other things, one of my, if we're talking about overviews, or if we're talking about initial reactions, one of the things that stood out to me in this book is the way that they really do put their finger on the problem of, one of the quotes in here is, what is a resume? It's a record of a person's career with all the accomplishments embellished and all the failures removed. And that, of course, makes hiring very difficult, because, how much information do you really have on someone from the outside that you're trying to bring in to join a team. And, how can you go about making sure you don't hire a lemon, and, that you hire the best possible candidate for you, or at least a candidate who is an A candidate, to use their A player, as they call it. That is extremely difficult. And one of my initial reactions on this, I'm reading it obviously coming from the world of academia, is wow, this is their way of advocating hiring is pretty close to as opposite how academic job searches have or happen for faculty, how academic job searches are prosecuted or are executed, I suppose. Prosecuted is about as good a word as you're going to get for that, actually. But how academic job searches are executed, it is as pretty close to as opposite this process as you can get. And so one of my initial reactions was, I don't want to say rage, but a little bit of simmering anger as I continue to get more and more disenchanted by the academic hiring process, which is so frustrating because it does not take a rational or a best, it does not, these searches don't take the approaches that are most likely to lead to hiring the best fit or the best candidate or whatever. Whereas, something like this book would, or like the method advocated in this book, would be much more likely to work. But unfortunately, getting this sort of thing to be employed in the culture of higher ed for faculty hires would be pretty close to impossible, it seems. So,
well, and does academia still use resumes or?
Well, it's curriculum vitae or CVs that are used. So they're actually beefed up resumes that, there are a couple primary differences in academia where basically a CV is all the stuff that you've done that is supposedly relevant to the job. So you list out, your prior jobs, your articles that published, the prior books you've published, presentations, things like that. But unlike a resume, a CV might go on for 30 pages. Resumes are usually one or two pages, right?
One of my clients, a marketing professor, his is 40.
Yeah. I've seen some really, really large CVs before. And, in academia, there is a sense that, bigger is better in that among a lot of people. So it is a little different than a resume, where generally you're trying to boil it down ideally to one page, or once you're at the executive level, or you've got a lot more experience, you're going 2 or 3 pages at max with a CV, and you have things like, oh, these are my core competencies, these are things that I do well, and you just list those things on your resume. Or when I was in this job, I was responsible for these things and I did these things, these were outcomes or whatever. That stuff's just not on a CV, right?
Yeah.
What you do is you list, these are my peer-reviewed articles. These are the courses that I've taught at these various institutions. These are the books that I've written. These are the presentations that I've given. These are the service opportunities that I've been engaged in, and et cetera. And you just list all that out, and that's that. And so it's a little bit different, but it's just like a resume in that basically you're not listing, well, these are the 17 articles that I've had rejected. These are the negative book reviews that were penned about the book that I put out there, et cetera. And you don't even list the impact factor of the articles that you have. I mean, it's basically, well, what journals have you published your articles in? And if these are adequately peer reviewed and top tier journals, then you're a better candidate than someone who hasn't published in those journals, and so on. And there's a sort of arithmetic to it, but it doesn't really give you much more than, okay, this person has done some stuff on paper.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I mean, for me, I've worked for myself for almost 10 years now. And in the past 10 years, as I've worked with different people or companies on their projects, every now and then I'll get a request, can you send me your resume? And when people ask me that, I've gotten to the point where I kind of look at them like, are we are we in the year 2017 or what happened here? Because you've got LinkedIn, you've got like I do website development, so my body of work is actually
You've got a portfolio.
If you go online. Yeah, there's a portfolio. And so the idea of a resume to me is crazy. And now even LinkedIn allows you to just do a PDF of your profile. So that's what I usually do now if somebody asks for a resume, because I don't actively keep a resume anymore. And when people ask me that, I just kind of look at them with a strange look, because I think we're past that point. And that quote you just mentioned is a good reason why. I mean, it just embellishes everything and
removes all the failures.
Yeah.
But again, in academia, the CV as the mark of who you are is your CV as much as anything else, especially on the front end of hiring in academia. So, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon. So, that's where it's kind of backwards and antiquated in that regard. And I got a little frustrated as I was reading this book for that reason, because a lot in this book made a lot of sense in terms of how things should work, and they'd work better than the current methods employed in higher ed. Yeah.
Well, on to the favorite quotes. My first one was who, not what. Pretty basic, but they go on. They say, who refers to the people you put in place to make the what decisions. And as you so adeptly pointed out at the beginning, there still is a lot of requirement for the what. And what I've seen in my work with different companies is that the what is rarely ever defined. So this book is kind of a perfect case scenario of a hiring process. But as you said, the what needs to be defined first, of what you're even looking for, what the person will be doing, what the company itself does, and how that person will fit in. And those are the more difficult things to define before you even get into the hiring process. So I like the focus of this book, that it's on the who, but there's a lot of things that go into that, just in addition to all the different components of hiring somebody.
Yep. So my first favorite quote is, beware. Somebody who has an excessive need to be me, is telling you that they are not open to adapt their style to fit your culture or your company and should not be hired. This is part of listen for comments like, that's just me, I'm not organized, or that's just me, I'm impatient. That's just me, I don't include other people in decisions. That's just the way I am. And that's where they say, beware. Somebody who has an excessive need to be me is telling you that they are not open to adapt their style to fit your culture or your company and should not be hired. And there are certain things like that in this book that sound so regressive to an ear trained for certain identity culture type things and or identity aspects of this culture, that we all need to be accepting of who you need to accept who I am, or what my life is really about is being true to myself. And in this book, there is that sense of, if you find someone whose core philosophy or core source of how they live their life is to be true to themselves, don't hire that person. That person is not going to be a good fit for any company. So just go ahead and give them a hard pass, and let's go ahead and move on. And
all right. So people don't keep it real.
Yeah.
Don't keep it real.
Well, keep it real, but keep it real without having to be, true to yourself. Be willing to actually become your better self.
Keep it adaptively real.
Yeah, there you go. Keep it adaptively real. Yeah. I mean, but the thing is, who I am right now is not who I want to be in 10 years. I want to be better in 10 years than I am now. And just being me is not going to be the way to get there. I have to actually go out of my way to improve. And the way that they put that was really pithy. And again, struck me as something that there would be a reaction against by many people, but those are precisely the people that you shouldn't be hiring.
Yeah. Well, and in that same section, my second favorite quote was right alongside that.
Yeah, this is a section on red flags in the hiring process.
Yeah, and it just made me think of a certain country that just puts someone in power who speaks about this a lot. So winning too much. I would look out for people in the hiring process who boast about winning battles that do not matter that much. So I'll just leave that one at that. And
Yep.
yeah, it just made me think.
Yeah, I loved the story where that went with that, actually, where he said, for example, a friend of mine was boasting about how he bought a toy and then found somebody else across town who was selling it for half the price. So he told me about how he returned it, drove across town, and bought the cheaper one. He won all right, but he spent 2 hours of his time to save $10. So his need to win in that way makes him do stupid things. You should beware of candidates who need to win to an unhealthy extent because they will be battling you and your colleagues over petty things. There's some wisdom there, man.
Yeah.
All right, my second quote.
And last.
And this is certainly, it's a short book. It's a quick read, so I didn't have a ton of stuff here. But my second, and this is definitely my favorite quote from the book, is talented people know what they want to do and are not afraid to tell you about it. Talented people know what they want to do and are not afraid to tell you about it. And this is when it's talking about, you want to get a sense of what this person's goals are, and as you're driving through the interview process, you want to find out what makes them, what do they want to do, and what are their professional goals and their aims and all this. And, they basically say, if he or she lacks goals or sounds like an echo of your own website, screen the person out, because that means they're not one of the talented people who's going to have their own head on their shoulders and is going to have a sense of direction, and they're not afraid to tell you about it if they're that kind of talent. That's the kind of person you want to have. And I found that interesting because, again, that runs counter to a lot of our cultural forces where we tend to beware in popular culture and in the way that people are trained not to rock the boat. Just culturally, we tend to emphasize making sure that you're not too vocal about your goals or who you what you want to become, or all of these things, because you can sound cocky. And to some extent, they want that person who's maybe a little bit, maybe on the edge of cocky, as long as that person doesn't fit those needing to win too much and some of these other red flags. You've got to have somebody who is that driven that they want to tell you about what they're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, very, very good practical advice. We get into a little more of that later, but I think those quotes just show the practicality of the book and how it's common sense stuff, but it's maybe things that you haven't thought about in the sense of within the hiring process. So I really appreciated that about the book.
Yeah, well, and this wasn't in my quotes list, but it actually goes along with what you just said in terms of a lot of this book is obvious, right? Or it should be obvious. But they have this quote that actually sort of puts in that explains the value of the book. It's not actually intended to serve as that, because they're telling those who are on hiring committees, make sure, it says, don't be afraid to write down what might seem blindingly evident. In the heat of a hiring crisis, the clearest things sometimes get overlooked. And that, I think, is the value of a book like this, where when you're actually going and starting the process of looking for someone to hire, or you're engaged in the process of hiring, you actually need to go back and think through what should be common sense, what should be blindingly obvious. And that's mostly what they did in this book, is they wrote down the blindingly obvious that unfortunately is not widely practiced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's get into a little more of that nitty gritty of the book. One thing that stuck out to me is just why is this important? Why is hiring important? And the first thing they mention is it's important because of the cost. The average hiring mistake costs 15 times an employee's base salary in hard costs and productivity loss. So a $100,000 employee will result in a $1.5 million loss. So picking the right people is important for getting things done, the company culture, all that stuff, yes, but it's also very important if you're looking to spend $100,000 a year on an employee and you don't find the right one. You need to go ahead and realize that you're going to lose 1.5 million on average.
Yeah, or if you want to bring it down to $30,000, right? So you're just hiring a $30,000 employee. So that means somebody who you're paying maybe $20,000 a year plus some benefits, right?
Mm-hmm.
A mistake there is going to cost $500,000.
Wow.
Those are real numbers, man.
Yeah.
It's 450,000, but I rounded up a little bit. But wow. Wow. Yeah. So, and again, what their point is in writing this book is that hiring process. It's as their quote says, it is hard to see people for who they really are during the hiring process. When you're hiring somebody from outside, you're looking at that resume, and the resume isn't going to tell you who they are. It's just telling you that embellished, failures removed version of this person that's going to look squeaky clean. And you can't know based on looking on paper who this person really is. And you know, it's one of those things, it reminds me of the quote, I may get it wrong, just a little bit wrong, but you know, we wanted workers and we got people instead.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, that's the reality that everybody has to face, is that when you hire someone to do a job, you're actually hiring a person that then you actually have to deal with and work with.
Wait. I thought there were resources. I thought there were human resources. They're people?
Yeah, they're human resources. That's the problem, right? And it's also the benefit if you hire the right kind of person. If you hire a good whom, then you're going to actually get the benefits of having a human being, a person, rather than just a resource. Mm-hmm. But if it goes the other direction, that person is going to help pull you back in the opposite direction.
Yeah. One is, you mentioned an objective standard. They give good ways to do that, and one is they use a scorecard, and they use that in the selection and what they call the sell process. So the selection is obviously choosing amongst different people, and the sell process is to then sell that person the job, and they give different ways to do that. Even selling to the person's family, especially if it's going to be a move for the family.
Which is interesting, because that actually, and this gets, I'm going to get into this a couple other times, that breaks into some of those legal gray areas, right? Because you're not actually allowed, and they mention this, like, make sure you don't ask illegal questions, like whether someone's married or, you know, whether they have family or these other things. And then, of course, they say, but you need to recruit their family.
Yeah.
Right. So that is an interesting thing. There's a lot of places in this book where it kind of comes up and you're like, interesting how this works legally, because you have to be really careful to apply this well. Otherwise you could potentially end up in legal trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. And
but
getting
scorecard,
into the scorecard, and then just getting into more of the practical advice. I mean, these are just gems. Like, if you haven't read the book, just even hearing these things is just very helpful. So I've got 5 that really stuck, or one from you and a few from me that really stuck out. Is the first one is just, if you're looking to hire, ask your existing employees for recommendations. I remember I in college I worked at a Mexican restaurant, and my boss asked me for recommendations for my friends if they were interested in working, and he ended up hiring 2 of my friends.
Biggest mistake he's ever made.
I know, and the Mexican restaurant is no longer there as a result. So that was a mistake, but it was a good advice. This I thought was just really smart. When you're sitting down with the person, you ask them to spell out their previous boss's name. So even if it's like Smith, you say, so Smith, like Smith. Yeah,
well, and this is right in the context of, so if I'm going to contact, when I contact your boss for to talk about you as a reference, make sure I got his name right, and then you do that.
Yeah. Well, and for the purpose, in starting off the interview with that, for the purpose of, if it puts the person in the mindset of, okay, this person is going to contact my boss. I need to be completely straightforward. It does something to the candidate to where it gives them the impression, even if you're not planning to contact that particular boss or anyone of their previous employers, the fact that you're asking that, these guys say that it helps the person be a little more genuine in their answers.
It makes a lot of sense too, just psychologically, because again, the mindset changes of what is my boss going to say? I'd better say something that's going to work with that.
Yeah. It takes the person out of the resume mode of embellishment, and I think I'm good at that, but I messed up so there might be a better balance I can present here. So
yeah, one other one, hitting the gong fast. I liked that one.
Yeah,
using the old Gong Show as a. Well, I guess there's a reboot of the Gong Show coming out at some point. I don't know if that's hit or not. I don't really pay attention, but apparently there's one coming out. But the basically. Don't linger with candidates who might be a bad match. Once you've decided, this person probably doesn't work, don't send them to, other colleagues to interview that person, hoping that they'll find something that you didn't. Just hit the gong and move on to the next person, because there will be don't waste your time on someone that isn't already clearly what you want, when you could find that when the next person may be that person. So hit the gong quickly. Again, don't waste time.
Yeah, and in line with that, interrupt the candidate.
I love that one.
Yeah, if they're just going on about something and you either get the point or they're probably embellishing, just interrupt them and move on to the next thing. Time is money. And the last one, talk to subordinates in addition to bosses. So most people just ask for give me a list of your bosses so I can talk to them. But what about the people under them, especially if you're hiring that person to manage a number of people in the company? Make sure that the people under them like them, because that'll probably even be more important than their one boss liking them. The fact that they have good working relationships with everyone who will be under them.
Yeah, and actually, I thought, again, some of this is we're mixing some of the sections here, because what they did is they divided it into, setting your scorecard, so that having to do with how you're going to define the job, and then sourcing, right? So you have to find out where you have to find a way to get employees or get people to apply. You have to have a pool from which you can pull, and then it's selection, which is the actual interview process. And then it's the recruitment side of things, actually attracting that person there. And what they're doing is they're trying to, make sense of that whole process, going step by step. We're mixing a little bit of that, but one of the things that I really liked was how there was a coherent way of going through each piece, and some of these pieces work together once you actually combine the whole book. So again, talking to subordinates in addition to bosses, and asking existing employees for recommendations, those go together, right? So when you're talking to someone who is a subordinate as a reference, right, you want to talk to, and they're talking about find 7 or 8 references. Once a person gets far along into the process, talk to a bunch of people who've worked with or for that person. And that goes together with the existing employees for recommendations, right? So sourcing may already start with, well, I've already talked to a couple people who are solid references for this person, or I may have looked at this person's LinkedIn profile and they're linked to someone who I know, and that person wrote a very solid recommendation on LinkedIn for this person, so I'm going to go ahead and give them a look. So much of this process that they're putting in this book depends on that word of mouth aspect, or talking to or addressing people who have worked with this person before. This reference aspect is on both the front and the back end of how they're doing it. And to me, that makes so much sense, because if you really want to know who a person is, talk to people who've worked with that person. Don't look at their resume. Talk to somebody who's actually done a project with that person, or has actually supervised that person, or has been supervised by that person, or ideally all of the above, and you'll have a pretty good idea of who that person is really rapidly. Mm-hmm. And I love that they basically put that on the front end with getting recommendations and keeping a list of people that have been recommended to you before. I mean, they mentioned one executive who keeps a weekly call list that he goes down, he's got like a spreadsheet where, every week he calls a couple people. He sets time aside to call a couple people who are on his possible hire list, for the future, to just talk to them and to make that contact and to maintain that contact. And then when he talks to them, he'll try to pull another couple names of, also, if I ever have an opening, is there anybody that you would know that we would do? And then he adds that person to his list, and he just keeps that weekly call list going. To me, that is so smart in terms of doing the sourcing process differently. Again, dealing with
proactively.
Yeah, proactively and working from the from recommendations and references on the front end rather than the back end, and that just makes so much sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that opposed to what they refer to early in the book as voodoo hiring methods, right? They talk about, you've got to get out of the habit of passively witnessing how someone acts during an interview. I mean, come on. You're going to make a decision on hiring someone who you may have to work with for a decade plus on how on what they looked like or how they seemed to behave or how they acted for like half an hour or an hour, or, if it's a really big interview process, a day or two, while you only have a few, at most a few hours of a certain day with this person, you're going to hire someone based on that. Because, different people, when they're under the stress of that interview, you're going to get different things. Some people are going to be themselves. Other people are not. And you just don't know what you're getting out of that. And they just say, listen, this is all voodoo. And there's, they make the case that both the data and, anecdotally, the basic rule of thumb is that there is that basically it's totally random what the results are based on interviews. And I'm trying to find the quote here that interviews, or the standard interview process, the common interview process, here we go. Common interview processes are almost a random predictor of job performance. So you could basically just hire anyone.
Just flip a coin.
Yeah, once somebody's applied to it, just flip a coin. And, again, this is where I get really frustrated, because as they say, the sourcing part was probably the most interesting to me in many respects. Although, again, the references thing will come up again, because I was really interested in that. Because, again, universities and academic hiring process, it's totally different. What they say is the overwhelming evidence from our field interviews is that job ads, are a good way to generate a tidal wave of resumes, but a lousy way to generate the right flow of candidates. You know how every academic job search starts, and has to start in most cases by law, with a job ad that gets posted, and then, in my field, you say 150 or 200 CVs and cover letters and whatever else they require go in, and then you sit, and your committee sits in the room, and you sift through all those, and you narrow it down to your 15 or 20 candidates that you give a 20-minute or 30-minute first round interview, often either at a conference or via Skype or something like that, and then it gets narrowed down to 3 from those, and then you bring those people on campus, and you hopefully hire one of them. Well,
and what I saw in a company to be unnamed is that they already had someone in mind, but by law they had to put it out.
Oh, that happens a lot
in the paper, and so and then you've got all these people putting in resumes and cover letters and spending time to do this, and they're just throwing them all away because they just legally had to do it, but they already know who they're going to hire.
Yeah, that unfortunately happens quite a bit too. Although, again, if you're the company and you already know this person is going to be a good fit for the scorecard we have, then yeah, it makes sense to just hire that person.
Yeah.
But, to me, I just get frustrated by the way that these things work at the university level, partly because, I've been on the job market in that world for a while, and I've totally lost faith in how that job market works based on who I see getting hired at some of these places, knowing what the job search said, knowing that I've had interaction with this person in various ways over time, and it's like, wait, they hired that person for that job? I know at least 8 or 9 people that I've worked with in the past that are better candidates for that job Like objectively, there's no way that that person is even close to as good of a candidate as these like 8 or 10 other people.
Yeah.
And it may not even be me in that group, right? I may just go, well, when I'm applying to the job, who knows? I mean, it's a random predictor in terms of almost random in terms of whether you get interviews or not. It seems like in academia anyway. But some of the time, the people that get hired, it's just baffling, and it's very, very strange. And to me, it would just make so much more sense, and I would prefer it. I mean, it would benefit me if basically university committees would say, okay, you can apply or whatever, but essentially once we get narrowed down to like the 30 or so that, on paper, we know that you've published enough or whatever that you could get tenure here or whatnot. From there, we're not even going to do first round interviews. We're just going to talk to like 7 or 8 people who've worked with you, who you've worked for, et cetera, et cetera. We're just going to talk to them and we're going to see what your references say. Well, danged if that wouldn't help.
Yeah.
Like, would this person fit what we want for the job? Well,
yeah.
I guarantee you that would be better outcomes. That would lead to better outcomes in academia. But basically, nobody does it that way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, since this book is in the middle of effective executive and start with why, I thought it'd be a good idea to discuss commonalities and differences with the effective executive, and then next week when we discuss start with why, we can discuss all 3 of these books. But there were a few similarities, and one was that these authors of Who say that there are no generalists, there are only specialists, and that was something we discussed quite a bit last week. You've got to focus on one major thing, and the more you try to do a bunch of different things, it's not gonna work. And this actually is coming up quite a bit in Plato that I'm reading right now, The Republic, when they talk about different working methods
and roles in society as well, as he puts that forward. And again, all this is in the context of an organization, right?
Yeah.
This is not saying that someone can't do multiple things and do them excellently. But what it is saying is if you're hiring someone for a position in an organization, and this is where Drucker makes that distinction, it does you no good to get someone who is above average at like 10 things, but you're only hiring that person for 1 or 2. Get someone who's excellent at that 1 or 2. And they're saying the same thing here. And of course that makes sense because Smart actually was a graduate student under Peter Drucker. So
yeah. Well, and a few places, so we see Drucker mentioned throughout the book, starting in the introduction. So you can tell that Drucker's had a big impact on these guys, but they do differ on one point in particular, and that is with chemistry over contribution. There's a quote on page 32 and 33 where it says chemistry, and they're actually quoting Bill Johnson, the CEO of Heinz. Chemistry is always important for both the individual and the company. If I don't have good chemistry with you and you don't have good chemistry with me, then skip it. Connecting with them personally is important. That becomes obvious in my initial conversations with the candidate. So this differs somewhat from Drucker, who on page 74 of The Effective Executive says, effective executives never ask, how does he get along with me? Their question is, what does he contribute? He obviously that being he or she in the hiring process, but that's something where they differ. They in the Who book they talk a little more about chemistry and getting the right person in there, and Drucker is more about look at what he or she contributes before the question of chemistry. They seem to flip those around, the 2 of them.
Yeah, it was interesting to see some of those differences, and there were a few. But even where there were differences, they were developing Drucker as much as anything. It was just saying, well, Drucker says this about objective, but you have to keep this in mind as well. And I'm guessing that for the most part, Drucker would agree with where they're going, especially since they're starting again from these are the objectives of the job. Mm-hmm. That comes up front for them, and actually that's useful. Even once you have employees, if you haven't set a scorecard for your employees by which they can be objectively assessed, then doing step 1 of what this book recommends for hiring is actually a useful exercise even when you have employees already, because it helps you assess the performance that you're getting. So, and Drucker would certainly be in favor of that.
Yeah, well, and they both agree on focusing on strengths to be exceptional at one thing. More of that, kind of along the lines of the first thing I mentioned of no generalists. There are only specialists, or you should only be hiring them. So, just neat book to read right after Effective Executive.
Yeah, and there's also one other thing there in terms of the hiring, the excellence, and all this. And this gets this gets to helping understand what they mean by chemistry as well. What they don't mean by chemistry is someone who's really good with the soft skills and is going to be someone that everybody likes to be around, right? The issue is, do you fit the culture and the vision of the company? And for that, I thought the cheetahs versus lambs thing that they did starting on page 160 was really interesting in terms of which CEOs had been successful in the jobs to which they were hired.
Yeah, that was excellent. It was so excellent. I think you should read it.
No, I'm going to turn that one over to you. You're the CEO here.
Oh, okay. So yeah, this is one of the main things that stuck out to me. So I'm going to read the lambs section first. Boards and investors have a tendency to invest in CEOs who demonstrate openness to feedback, possess great listening skills, and treat people with respect. These are executives who have mastered the soft skills. We call them lambs because the CEOs tend to graze in circles, feeding on the feedback and direction of others. Boards love lambs because they are so easy to work with. And in fact, in our study, lambs were successful 57% of the time. That's not a bad success rate. A batter who hit 570 over a career could walk backwards into the Hall of Fame. The second dominant profile that emerged from our analysis was of CEOs who move quickly, act aggressively, work hard, demonstrate persistence, and set high standards and hold people accountable to them. We call these CEOs cheetahs because they are fast and focused. Cheetahs in our study were successful 100% of the time. This is not a rounding error. Every single one of them created significant value for their investors. Every
single one in the study.
Yeah. That was amazing.
And again, this gets back to when we were reading the Effective Executive. You remember that, or the Effective Executive.
Effective.
Yeah, you remember that I'd said that much of that book reminded me of Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And Steve Jobs was no lamb, right? I mean, he was not a pleasant person to be around in many, many ways.
Many people cried.
Yeah, he made people cry. He put a ton of pressure on people and everything. But man, if that guy wasn't, a great CEO, he built a company that had a culture that, that people who've worked there have generally loved it. People who worked with him stayed there and they wanted to work with him. And it's not because he was touchy-feely. It's because he was driven and he held a standard and had a very clear vision and would very quickly go after that vision and require other people to go with him. So I thought that was interesting.
My favorite story of Jobs is that he once told Bill Gates that his product was poop. And instead of using the word poop, he used the word that starts with SHIT.
Yeah, the one that we're going to avoid on this show to maintain our non-explicit rating.
Yeah, but he told that to Bill Gates. That's awesome.
Well. He also told Bill Gates that Gates that Gates basically had boring products, and that he'd be better off if he went to an ashram and did some acid. So I mean, there's that too. So I mean, Jobs is an interesting guy.
Yeah, but I do think Gates was one of the guys who also visited Jobs towards the end.
Oh yeah.
So he was in the inner circle. I mean, they had enough respect for each other that they were able to get past those things.
Well, I don't know that it was actually even getting past those things. I think it was just that's Jobs.
Yeah.
there's no getting past it because that is him.
Yeah.
You get past it and you're past him. So, but again, if you want your company to do well, you get people who are going to do the job well, not necessarily somebody you want to go to drinks with.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? If you get somebody who does the job well, it may turn out that you actually want to go get drinks with that person as a result.
Yeah.
But if it's putting the first things first and the second things not at all in that regard. But again, still having a focus on the chemistry, on what is needed for the role and what kind of company do we have? Do we have a company where conflict is a regular part of the day, or do we have a company where that's gonna actually negatively affect everybody around? That's going to depend. That's going to determine which type of person you hire. But you still want to hire a cheetah who's going to fit your culture, and I think that's where they go with this.
Well, I had one other item I wanted to hit on, and they talk a lot about personal integrity outside of the work environments, and it reminded me of a guy that my wife and I worked with in the UK, and he used to he hired a lot of people, and he would do something where he would give them some money to go buy something in a grocery store. And then he would just sit back and watch how they treated the person at the counter. And he would base a lot of decisions off of that. You know, were they really dismissive of that person? It was in his organization that their goal was to really care for people. And so if the person he was looking at went up to the counter and obviously didn't care anything about the person behind the counter, that told them a lot about the person. And so I thought that, they brought it up a lot in the book, and then it just reminded me of that story and how important it is to look at candidates if you can get them out of the stale environment of sitting in a office and doing the interview. But if you can get them outside of that and see them around other people, see them in different situations than some really weird 30 minutes of sitting down asking questions.
Yeah, although I have to say, where getting them into those situations in an interview context is still giving an artificial view. Because, even if a person is a donkey, that person may be smart enough not to be so in the hour-and-a-half meal that they have with the job search committee or something.
Yeah.
What you can do, though, is, and this is where the book is I think hits it out of the park, is talk to their subordinates. Talk to people who've been around them in those cases and ask specifically about that stuff. If you can, find that out. And the other thing is, again, this gets back to sourcing. Hire people you've been around before the interview. Hire people that you've sourced before you actually get to that point. And you've actually been around them in a meal setting, or you've been on a flight with them, or whatever, and you take notes of, okay, this person was actually, courteous and a decent person to the people that were in the service industry around her or him in that environment. And I'm going to take note of that for if we ever have to hire this person.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get to the conclusions, come back to the big picture, talk about recommendations, anything else here. I think you've got the most to say in this section, so turn it over to you.
All right, and I've hit on a lot of these, so I'll just keep this brief. And my first thing is that this is a great reference book. It will be helpful for when I am hiring. I can imagine someone reading this who is in the midst of hiring or will be hiring soon. This would be extremely valuable. So yeah, great, good advice, smart advice, and 176 pages, 174. So you can get it through pretty quickly. So, in terms of hiring books, I haven't read other ones that I know of, but this one seems to be a good one. The one thing that I wish they had addressed was how a company would find somebody like me. I'm not actively looking for a job, but that it doesn't mean that I'm not interested. And I have my own company, but I'm a freelancer of sort, in the sense of I just work with different companies on their web presence.
Other marketing aspects, yeah.
Yeah, on their marketing aspects. But how would a company approach trying to find someone like me? I'm not sending in resumes and that sort of thing. I think there's just a lot bigger job pool than than people consider out there, especially when some of the numbers out there are saying that 33% of the workforce is freelancers now. So they may not be actively searching for jobs, but they may be interested, or there could be an opportunity where you're not just looking at the people sending in their resumes, but you're broadening that by doing searches within LinkedIn or different things like that to find, or just even asking other people who they use. I would have liked to have seen a little more addressed on that.
Or even
topic.
how to hire a good freelancer is another issue, right? I mean, so not even taking someone from the freelance world and saying, well, we want to incorporate this person into our company, but how do you make sure that you hire someone good who does the sort of thing that you do? How do you go about that process and finding and sourcing those people and interviewing them and making sure that you get the best product possible? That's another question, right? And that's a totally other issue, because you're not actually incorporating that person into your organization, but that person is instrumental to the mission of the organization. So you better pick a good one.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your main takeaways from the book?
Aside from just a little bit of frustration about the way that academia does basically everything exactly the opposite of how this book suggests to do it. Aside from that, I will say that the book in a few cases made me reconsider a little bit about how to best answer certain questions in interviews. And basically, it's always good to have thought through what certain possible questions that you might get in interviews and how to present weaknesses or past failures or whatever. And that sort of thing is always tricky. But this book, I'm going to revisit this anytime I have an interview myself, to talk about to think about how I would actually want to best present myself in these interviews, even though people generally are doing the Voodoo technique, rather than any sort of rational way of hiring that has a good chance of success. There are certain things like where they say, a major red flag during the hiring process is that the candidate does not mention past failures. That's one, I starred that. And it's like, well, in the interview process, I'm generally not fronting past failures. And actually I have to think about, I have to think kind of hard about, okay, well, what past failures do I really have, as I go through, and thinking about how to consider what might constitute a past failure and how I should I should think through that and be more prepared for that in an interview, because just listing, well, I haven't landed a tenure track academic job as a past failure probably isn't what they're imagining.
Yeah.
But a lot of job searches, a lot of job committees do ask that question of what's a weakness that you have, or what's a past failure and how did you deal with it in various areas. And I think that's an area where I can get better as an interviewee. And there are a few other things over the course of the book that it's not just worth the read for those who are in the hiring position. I think it's worth it for those who are potentially being interviewed to, again, think about how this would make a person, how this would affect the perception of a person in that interview process. Though I just wish that, people would call, if you're listening to this as someone who is potentially interviewing me down the line, listen, find anybody who's ever worked with me before and call them. You'll find out who I am very quickly. I'm comfortable with you talking to anyone that I've worked with or for, or who's worked for me before. I would rather you do that than talk to me. You'll figure a lot more out with that than you will any other way. And again, this book does a good job of explaining why.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in along those lines, I could see myself in an interview like where they ask, "What's your weakness?" Turning it into like a humble brag thing where, well, I just care too much, and that's my biggest weakness. And I think it's how a lot of people answer those types of questions. But they gave the example
too hard.
of I work 18 hours a day.
I just don't have good home-work balance. I just give everything to the company. Okay.
But they give the example of Jamie Dimon.
Yeah,
I
Dimon.
think for J.P. Morgan, and they kept pressing him. What happened with this job? What happened? And finally, he just said, "I was fired. Okay, I was fired." And that I guess, according to these authors, was one of the reasons that he got the job, because he was just candid about it, and it wasn't like, well, I didn't agree with my boss, and so I just decided it was time to go. He just said, "I was fired."
Yep. Which, I mean, I think that can work just fine in some cases. In some cases, that probably isn't going to work. But
yeah.
It will tell you a little bit. Again, it's about fit.
Yeah.
And they talk about that. You need to make sure that you value fit a great deal, and that it turned out that his candor is exactly what they wanted. Now, in some cases, that may not work, but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, thinking about what real weaknesses might be versus, the humble brag version, and actually being able to put a real weakness in play. And I can think of a few real weaknesses that I've had, or that I still have. One of which is difficulty saying no to certain things, which then allows, gets away from the focus that I need to have, which is something we've talked about on this podcast previously, as, big emphases of a lot of the books that we've read so far is, learn to say no so that you can be really good at the couple things that you value. And that, that's one I'll probably roll with in the future. But anyhow, yeah, that's probably the biggest, aside from just frustration with the academic workforce that I had.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's going to do it for us this week. And today, before we get out of here, just a reminder, follow us along, booksofTitans.com, Twitter, Instagram, @BooksOfTitans. And we're all up on all the podcast things, Stitcher, iTunes, Android. And I looked at some of the stats this past week. I see that people are listening from all over the world and on a lot of different devices. So that's really encouraging. And we, if you like it, give us some reviews and tell your friends about the podcast. We want more people to enjoy this and to hear it. And we're having fun doing it. So hopefully you're having fun listening to it. We'd also appreciate any feedback you have. You can email from the website itself or hit us up on any of the social platforms. Next week we're talking about Start With Why by Simon Sinek. Awesome book. Can't wait to discuss it. On behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Erik Rostad, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening.
Keep listening, keep reading, keep improving,
and keep adaptively real.
I made this.